ja, guten Abend. We already lost someone. Ken Kessler is gone. I hope he comes back. But still, guten Abend. I think he'll be back in a minute, and we keep him up again. And as long as he is trying to get back, we just start the discussion. Yeah. Michael, you're well known, not only on my channel, so I think no introduction needed. Same goes for Stunty. We did quite some things together here on my channel. But still, Michael, how are you? Nice to see you again.
I'm good. Everything's great. You know, my new website's doing great. And everything I did that uprooted my whole life last year worked out really well so far. So
that's really good. So tracking angle is doing fine. You do a lot of reviews. I see. It's almost a daily information base. Important, quick information.
I've got 12 good writers working for me, which is really, really good. So
12 already. Wow.
Yeah, I got really good writers. I have a guy in Oslo writing for me.
Okay.
Jan Olmsdal, who's a really good writer and very well known in Norway. And okay, there's Ken. Hey, Ken.
Yeah, something happened during the intro. Out, but here
no
I am.
Problem.
Hello, guys.
Hello. Ken.
Yeah, okay.
So Ken, as you are for the first time, which of course is a huge pleasure, and I'm totally proud to have you here on the channel as a first-time visitor. Maybe tell those few of us who haven't heard so much about you. Tell us something. Where do you come from? Your review, what you're doing. Actually, you're also a reviewer. Introduce us a little bit.
We're talking like the other Michael, and both of you gentlemen, I'm sure. This is a lifetime pursuit for me. I started collecting records when I was 12 years old, and that became the obsession. The hi-fi became the means to listen to the music. The hi-fi was never the primary goal, but by whatever twist of fate, I ended up reviewing hi-fi equipment as well as reviewing music. So I've now been collecting for, that's 58 years. So I've got about 12 or 15,000 LPs, the same number of CDs, and of late I've been collecting open reel tapes from before 1985, not the current stuff. My obsession was the music, starting with the Beatles. As Michael F. knows, I emigrated to the UK in 1972 because I was a total Anglophile. So even though the Beatles had already broken up, when I got here, the biggest thing was Bowie. To put this into perspective, I arrived here during the glam era, and it was like paradise for me. Fortunately, my career took off such that I could go back and forth to the States 2 or 3 times a year. Professionally, I've been with Hi-Fi News since 1983. Over the decades, I've written for something like 300 titles, not all hi-fi music. I also write about wristwatches, and for about 10 years, I was reviewing cars. Now, what's pertinent to this discussion, I review hardware and music for Hi-Fi News. And as we discussed prior to the show starting, at one point, for about 15 years, I was reviewing 60 albums a month. Half reissues, half new, which is one of the reasons why my library is so massive. Now it's a bit more rarefied, which is what the topic is tonight, about the role of the reviewer, because my type of reviewing is different from conventional reviewing in the music magazines, where it's all about the performance. On my side of the typewriter, the word processor, it's just as much about the sound quality, because my milieu is a hi-fi magazine, not a music paper.
And, you know, it's not only that, Ken. I think you're buying a product, and this is one of the annoying things about, like, the New York Times. New York Times will devote full stories to the acoustics of a hall that most people will never get to visit. And then when they review music in records or CDs, they never talk about the sound quality. And you're buying a product, and you're entitled to know whether it's going to sound good when you play it at home, but they don't tell you that.
Well, this is one of the problems. This is one of the problems that faced me when I arrived at Hi-Fi News. At around 1980 to 85, when I started getting into writing here in the UK, the senior writers were pretty much classical and jazz only. And they looked down on the guys that listened to rock or other genres, saying, well, how can you judge music or a sound system with that because it's a studio creation? And I would turn around, being a smart aleck, and say, how do you know what that sounds like? Because you weren't there the night that Von Karajan conducted in that particular hall. So please don't tell me you know what Carnegie Hall sounded like in 1966. I know for a fact that your fat butt was in London. And then they would go off in a huff. But on the other hand, I know what a Fender guitar sounds like. My wife plays live music in the house 7 days a week. I hear acoustic music every single day, even though I cannot play a note. And luckily, even at my age, I can still hear with both ears, and the frequency response is pretty good. So it was an interesting thing. I'm sure you might have gotten the same problem, Michael, not being a musician, being more rock oriented. But it does influence the tenor of the reviews when you're writing, as Michael and I do, for hi-fi magazines, as opposed to writing for Downbeat or writing for...
Yeah, it's a different perspective.
Completely
different. I do play guitar. I'm a bad guitarist, but I do.
Yeah, because those readers want to hear how this record sounds on their equipment. You come from the equipment side, and then probably the lag to go to the sound of a record is not that far as when you write for the Rolling Stone magazine or stuff.
Right.
Like that,
But
right?
Here's the amusing thing, though. I've actually got a couple of albums where I was at the recording sessions, and Michael will remember one because he was there. There was a hi-fi brand called Aragon that used to have parties at CES, and one year they put together a band with all the journalists, Frank Doris and Alan Perkins and John Atkinson.
And I sang.
And you sang, and we were at that gig. But the recording, it was rock and roll. There was no left, right, center. It was a wall of sound. But equally, and this is why I'm still angry with these senior journalists. I was at Newport in 1967, and they've released at least 3 albums from those concerts. I was 15. That's 55 years ago. I don't know what the sound was like of Lionel Hampton in July of 1967 when I heard the album last year. Yes, it threw me back with a wave of nostalgia. But unlike sense of smell, I've been looking this up lately. Your sense of memory when it comes to hearing is terrible compared to taste and smell. In other words, if someone blindfolded me and they put a JBL L100 and an equal size Serwin Vega next to it and an AR, I wouldn't be able to identify which was which unless the performance was so grossly out of it. So to say that you had to be at the gig to review that album,
that's ridiculous. No, it's absolutely ridiculous, of course. So
what we also would like to discuss now, and what's the overall topic of today's meeting, is the state of reviewing nowadays, and that is of course beautiful that we now have such a knowledge of decades, so that you really can compare nowadays the times you already talked about, Ken, nowadays with YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and whatever websites, newspapers. So what has changed? What has changed to the better? What has changed to the worse? Michael, maybe you want to go on.
Anybody can hang up a shingle, a digital shingle, and call themselves a reviewer and start reviewing, and that's fine. But then the way they do it is to maximize a quick, to get people to come to their site quickly, and so people say outrageous things, or they have to declare something as the best. This is the best. A list of 10 things that are the best, from people who haven't heard that much. They haven't heard that much.
So you mean those rankings, those clickbait titles and stuff like that,
Yeah,
right?
this is the best. Or someone will write, I'm not using a direct drive turntable anymore, or I'm not using a belt drive turntable anymore. From now on, it's like all these things are put up there to get people to come to their channel, not necessarily to provide good information to people.
Yeah, controversy for the sake of it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that.
This new? Is it this new?
Well, sorry, Michael.
It's new in the sense that, and let's say over the last 15 years, there used to be a filter that would filter people out, and Ken would get to write for Hi-Fi News, or I'd get to write for the Absolute Sound or Stereophile, only if the editor felt that I had the talent to do it and I was doing it in a way that was responsible. Today, anybody can do it any place, and
there's no filter.
And that's okay in a certain way, as long as the person that's consuming this has some perspective on who the person is that's providing the information to them. And so anybody's entitled to do it, but it's important to know who's providing the information and what their background is, and where they come from and why they're saying what they're saying.
May I say that now we're having the discussion about reviewing in a very specific rail, and I think I would like, before we go, because now you're really talking about a certain type of reviewing the sound, and I think I would like then, at least for me, for myself, and I hope you would like that for yourself as well, to define what is the mission, what are the missions of reviewing. As a journalist who do review, what set of missions do you set to yourself?
But you've just identified there are two distinct.
For me, there are way more.
Exactly, there are two distinct issues here. Michael and I write in the hi-fi milieu where the sound quality matters. Whereas music press, whether you're talking classical magazines like Gramophone, or you're talking rock magazines, which might still exist, like for example,
Cream,
Mojo and Shindig. If you pick up an album, the reviews in Mojo or Shindig, they talk about the music, and maybe if it's an important reissue, they like the Beatles remasters, they might talk about the sound quality. With the hi-fi magazines, unless you're talking about new music where you have to discuss the performance, when you review the Beatles Revolver box set for a hi-fi magazine, it's only about the sound quality. But I'm going to tell you a little anecdote that's true, and it's why I don't want to be identified, nor does Michael, as just grumpy old men. But this is a true story, and for you, Stunty, it's about the music. One of the most important...
Not only, but yeah.
But it should the music should come first.
Absolutely.
One of the most important rock reviewers in the UK told me this story 25 years ago. Now, imagine you're 20 years old right now, and you want to be a rock reviewer. You have 65 years worth of history that you have to catch up on if you're going to be authoritative. It's just the fact of life. If you suddenly want to become a crime novel critic, you have to read a few thousand books. So it's mid-1990s. The single most important monthly rock magazine in England changes the editor in charge of the reissues section. My friend, who's a top reviewer, calls up and says, look, I've got the new Chuck Berry box set, 12 CDs, the complete Chuck Berry. What does this putz say to him? What's the significance of Chuck Berry? They put someone in charge of the reissues section of the most important hi-fi magazine in the UK with some amoeba. I don't even want to call him a fetus. The fact that he even didn't know the significance of Chuck Berry is endemic, worse today, because as Michael pointed out, any putz with a mouse and Wi-Fi can spew out whatever opinions they like. Me, I don't have to worry. I've got tens of thousands of hours of listening closely, and my IQ is in at least, I think, triple figures. But some of this stuff comes out there, and you have to wonder, no longer do you have to wonder why the current state of the music scene is just commercial pap.
Yeah, well, I have very similar experiences than you, with a few years delay. But as far as I'm concerned, when I sit to write a review and when I entitle myself with that power, I think I have three missions. First, information. This record exists. Then giving context. What is this recording? Where it's coming from, etc. And third, my opinion. And possibly a fourth one, being entertaining, because I always also add a specific extra mission to me. Is I always think, as I'm used to write for a print, that when I'm writing this for a new issue, about a new release of new music or a reissue, it's now. but there will statistically always be someone who finds that magazines in 20 years in a bathroom, and who will read that. So I always try to insert at least something that will still be relevant in the future in the writing, and that is basic frame of what is the work of reviewing according to me.
That's all very good points, because review should give some perspective on the artist, what the background is, who the person is, something about previous recordings. So you want to learn something from it, and you want to be entertained. If it doesn't entertain,
And
if it's boring,
like sharing the news. This record exists. That is basically the only real reason you exist.
Yeah. Well, for me, my life is actually much easier, because I mentioned earlier to you guys that probably I review about 8 albums a month, 4 digital, 4 vinyl, of which at least 6 of them will be reissues, which means I don't really have to discuss the music. So, for example, this year, the British group Madness has remastered and reissued their entire back catalog. Over the last 4 years or 5 years, Jethro Tull has reissued and remastered and expanded its entire back catalog. I don't have to say one word about Aqualung, because anyone...
Again, if you're talking to younger people, if you want to reach younger people that don't even know some of this music,
well, that's in the review, Michael. It'll say this was their best-selling album from 1975, and it's an example of prog rock. I don't just go straight to the sound. As you said earlier, Stunty, you've got to give some context, which I do. So, for example, I'm not an expert on Madness, but I can very easily do the comparisons. And also, and this is practical, has nothing to do with quality, when you start talking about something like the Beatles box sets, which have 5 bonus discs, you then have to explain to them, why would you want to buy this 6-disc box set instead of the single discs box? The single disc, or why not? That the single disc gives you just the album, which for 9 out of 10 people is probably enough. And this reminds me of another story. A friend of mine who's actually a Grammy winner, his name's Colin Escott, and he's the world's leading expert on Hank Williams. And one year, 2 different box sets came out of Little Richard. One was just the classic official releases. The other one was every damned outtake he ever made. And I had both sets, and Colin just looked at me and said, Ken, do you really want to hear Little Richard talking about getting his laundry done? And it's absolutely true that I never go back and listen to these extras. But equally, and you know this is true, Michael, when you're talking to hardcore, they want the 7-disc version of John Lennon with 19 takes of Yoko.
How do they find time? There's so much new and good music to listen to. Why? And everything is accessible now. How is there time to listen to all that?
There isn't, Michael. There isn't.
It's fan mentality and collecting. It's just that. And like, in order, in my opinion, to be a healthy and interesting being for yourself, you need to let go the idea of being a fan. Like, most artists only have 1, 2, 3 good records in their life. Some, but you have to be a fan to really love more than 3 records of a single band, in my opinion, most of the time.
The Stones and the Beatles, I could like.
The Stones, but it does raise that subject of who are the extras for, and will you ever listen to them again? And that's where, as a reviewer, I will say that, do you really want to listen to Yoko again and again and again, screaming behind John Lennon? And
I like Yoko.
I'm sure you do, Michael. But I remember Quentin Tarantino. This is about movies rather than music. Quentin Tarantino was once asked, why do his DVDs and Blu-rays not have extended editions and extra footage and deleted scenes? And he very smugly but rightly said, because I got it right the first time. So, do I really need... do I need Abbey Road? Do I need any extras for Abbey Road? Did it make any difference hearing 5 takes of Come Together? And I think, Michael, you might recall that once there was a bootleg that came out that was just all of the takes of Strawberry Fields Forever.
Yes.
So you would be hearing just the bass. Now, who's going to listen to 64 takes that have to later be assembled?
I don't think most of the people that have bought something like that will ever listen to it more than once. I don't.
That's a rhetorical question, obviously, because we all know the answer.
Right.
Yeah, but beautiful point.
There are some little
to
gems.
break to say something positive about those kinds of releases. You probably don't do it, but you could. You have it there.
True.
You can take it out of the shelf, and you could, if you one day want to. And this is also a nice feeling. Don't underestimate that, in my personal opinion.
I agree. I agree. But
Well, the other thing, and I know you're in the same boat as I am, Michael. When you're a reviewer, the albums come in faster than you can listen to them.
absolutely.
And if you're also a collector as well, you're buying stuff that's not that you're not necessarily going to review. My desk is full
Of
of
course.
CD box sets that have nothing to do with my work. And you wake up one day and you realize that you probably won't live long enough to listen to all of the albums that you have in
Not
storage.
even close. I have the
Yeah,
first record. I have the first records I ever bought. I have a 78 RPM version of the Mills Brothers singing the Glowworm song. I still have it.
Well, that's the curse of the collector.
I have the first single I ever bought, which was Mac the Knife by Bobby Darin. That was I mean, I had Elvis on 78s, and I still have those records. So,
well,
Like,
we're going
keep 'em.
more a little bit into personal, our personal taste and life. And for me, I'm lucky that like I have a bit like Ken, a little over 12,000 records plus a little less CDs, but like probably like 6,000 or so. But most of the music I have, like the vast majority of the music I have, only has one pressing. So that is.
Well, that's another story. That's
Yeah.
another story, which relates earlier to what I was talking about. If there's an album you want desperately and you didn't get an original, and a reissue comes along and it's not on one of these super labels, like I said, as an example, A Clear Light, which is a great Doors era psychedelic West Coast album, phenomenal album. I have
Double drummers.
It's been reissued twice, but it hasn't been reissued by Mobile Fidelity. It hasn't been reissued by Speaker's Corner. It's been reissued by a reissue label, not an audiophile label. Does it sound as good as the original Elektra pressing? Not bad at all. Does it sound as good as Chad Kasem might have made it? Probably not.
But does that mean that you shouldn't get it?
Exactly.
No.
Right.
Exactly. Because I wanted the music.
As long as you tell people what they're getting. As long as you tell people what they're getting.
Oh, for sure, Michael. Well, we have to store them.
Thank you, Michael, for point. 1 second. Thank you, Michael, for pointing that out, because I think as our topic is reviewing reviews, and we talk about reviewing now and then, and maybe Michael starts with it and we can go a little round. Do you have certain rules that applies in the 80s, 90s, and nowadays when you do a review? What are the pillars of doing it for you, if there are any?
Well, I remember when I was around when CDs first came out, and Ken was around when CDs first came out, and the sound was of every reissue that I heard on CD was horrible compared to the original vinyl record. Every single time, not even close. And so when I started reading reviews about how finally it's so quiet, and yeah, it's quiet. What's not there is great, but what was there was terrible. Terrible. I mean, Greg Calby came over. He had remastered all of the Peter Gabriel albums, all the Genesis albums, and he brought them over. And he was so proud of it. And we sat down and played a couple of them. And then I put on the original Charisma records. And he was like, so the first thing is to be honest about what you hear. And you don't have to make a value judgment of whether you like it or not. It's just, what are you going to hear compared to what came before if it's a reissue? If it's not as good, but you can't get it any other way, well, then you say, like the Clear Light records, the stuff that Sundays did, most of that was from digital sources. Bob Irwin got the original tapes because he worked for Sony, and he would master them at his place in Coxsackie and digitize it and then send the digital file to the pressing plant, to whoever was going to cut the lacquers. And some of them sounded really good and some of them didn't, but you have to say what you're getting. It's really important to tell people what they're getting. And it's really important for people to know what your stereo consists of, what you're listening on. You don't make a fetish of it.
One question, Michael. Did I hear correctly that you said, don't say if you like it or not, just say what you hear?
No, you could say if you like it or not too. Sure, of course, but that's not what's the most important thing. It's the same with hi-fi equipment when you review it. People say to me, well, I know what you like, and you reviewed something and you described what it sounded like, and I know you don't like that, but I like that, but I just want to know what it sounds like not whether you like it or not. So that's the important thing. So if you compare an original pressing to a reissue, and the reissue is bright and grainy compared to the original, well, then you say that. But I don't see how you can do otherwise.
Yeah, but let's also say I don't like it. It's the same almost.
Yeah, and then you say I don't like this way, right? That's fine.
There's a number of issues here because reissues are at a disadvantage if a tape is 50 or 60 years old. In other words, when they cut the first production masters or whatever for, say, the Doors' first album or the Buffalo Springfield album, the tapes were fresh. And even when they're stored as good as they can be. And we're not even going to go on that subject of the universal fire, where most of the master, God knows how many master tapes are gone.
Well, that was misstated. The story was misstated in the New York Times, and they should have corrected it. A lot of the tapes that they claimed were burnt up were not burnt up. You know, they said the Buddy Holly catalog was burnt up. It wasn't. They said the Steely Dan catalog was burnt up. Most of it wasn't. They made a lot of mistakes.
But
so anyway, that's
but there is still the matter of the aging of the tapes. But be that as it may, there's something you raised, Michael. One thing I discovered by accident. I have some, like you, plenty of first generation CDs, and what I found out, the CDs weren't the issue. It was the early players. Now, unlike analog, which you know you can get a better cartridge, but you're not changing what's on the vinyl. Because of the advances in the last 40 years in digital technology, if you take one of those 1983 CDs like Ronstadt's Greatest Hits or Peter Gabriel or whatever, which horrified you back in '84, and you play it on a circa 2023 state-of-the-art digital system, I promise you it's going to sound a lot better, because with the digital, you're just dealing with the data.
Yeah, but when it was converted from analog to digital to begin with, the converters were not very good in the early days. So
yeah, but some of them, you listen to some of those early things from Denon and Tellark, and they're not garbage. Let's put it this way. This stuff wasn't perfect, and anyone who said it was wrong. And this is Stunty. We've discussed the thing about the rhetoric of whether or not someone's telling a lie or just being economical with the truth. But the other thing that Michael raised that's very important from our type of reviewing as opposed to music critics, our readers know that we are giving any album, digital or analog or otherwise, its best shot, because Michael and I are not going to play a new pressing of Eddie Lockjaw Davis on a $200 turntable. We are in a position to give these releases the best shot they can get on the sound quality side of it. So if Michael gets a brand new pressing and says it's grainy compared to the original, that's fairly irrefutable because the system is transparent, the system is detailed, and he's compared it to an original. My little thing, I don't know if Michael does the same, but what I do when I review a reissue, my rule is to play it twice on two completely different systems.
It's like this record. You know, this record just came out.
I'm waiting for my copy.
Okay, so this is a get back from Italy from, I guess it was the 80s, I guess, 2002 actually. And this was licensed from Charlie, which, you know, has good tapes. This sounds okay.
Yeah,
it's but I always thought it sounded kind of grainy, but it was a great VJ recording in Chicago. You know, this is so much better. So you're gonna go crazy when you hear this, and you'll play it.
This is the one from Crap. Is this from Crap?
Yeah, and you'll go back and you say, "Boy, I can imagine what it was like when the Animals heard, you know, or when Van Morrison heard Boom Boom. You know, what did he said? Oh, that's that's something that he related to." Or Eric Burden when he heard Boom Boom. You know, you just know that those guys heard those records when they first came out, and it's just great to hear it sounding the way it's supposed to sound.
Oh yeah.
And I attempt to make a larger point, and you'll have please to excuse me that again, as Michael 45, English is not my first language, so I might bear with me. To
barely mine.
To Ken's point, and also to Michael 45, we just arrived at a turning point where most of the music now, the majority, will originally have been recorded digitally. So the point of the old tape, like reissues sitting at a disadvantage, doesn't really exist anymore for the future, at least. To also, and that is connected in a loose way to what I'm trying to say, which is, when do you do a negative review? I'll use an example of of mine. Like usually I have a rule that well, before that, the context is there's two types of records I reviews: the ones that I get assigned or that I receive for free, and the ones I buy that I want to actually herald, to champion.
Yes.
Which are the nicest to do, but also the most difficult, because you have to actually be more critical with yourself rather than critical with the music, the record. When I get assigned something, then just to be fair, as usually I get about 60, 80 new records a week, plus all the stuff that I actually listen to digitally, because it's like listening to a digital promo. If the music is new, fine. Then I can do a different layer of reviewing when I actually get the product, if I deem it even interesting to get it. But if it's the stuff that I get that I didn't necessarily pursue myself, then I have to be aware that I need to have some balance. There need to be some negative reviews. So when does a record when is it fair to do a negative review? Not necessarily because one artist fucked up and did something that I personally, because of all my background and exposure and ongoing exposure to music and music history, deem not that good or horrible. It's when that record is symptomatic of a larger issue that is of now. When I see that there is a wave that I personally, for my reasons that I can explain, think this is not the right way. This record is symptomatic of that. Tough luck for you if you're the one who it falls upon, but it's not necessarily about you. It will maybe feel personal, but there is actually a larger point that I need to illustrate with something. I remember one time I had like this guy who does analog techno, vintage hardware, really good. And the guy was doing dance floor music most of the time. And this record was the typical record when they try to sound more intellectual, doing like ambient, more like widescreen music. And it was totally cliche, and it felt like totally lacking everything that it should be if it came from the heart, rather than an attempt of flattering his own ego. And I concluded the whole thing with describing all that like, this feels like, as we say in French, France, if you look at a football game, a soccer game, when you lost the game 5-0, and you get a post-game interview and you have to go and face the camera and you say, well, we did our best. Tomorrow I'm going to go back to training and hope that we're going to be better the next day. And I say that it felt like that, the whole statement. Of course, the guy, like, he put almost like a hit on me when he read that. And I had to explain through intermediaries, go-betweens, that no, please, I can discuss it with you, blah, blah, blah. But that means that sometimes for the good, you put a target on yourself. And that is something that we obviously are going to discuss in the larger part. But like, I'm interested to hear your feelings about what I just explained as well, of course.
You have to be open to being yelled at and screamed at by the artists, or in the hi-fi side of things, walk into a room at a show where you've given a product a really bad review and have the guy scream and yell at you for as much time as they want. If you're afraid of that, if you have to only say positive things because you're afraid of of the consequences, then you should be a publicist and not a reviewer. A reviewer has to be much more open to getting the criticism back from the artist or from the record label. You just have to.
But this also references, and Michael will remember this from our earliest days as audiophiles before we became part of the industry. There used to be a big problem with American hi-fi magazines because they only published non-critical good reviews.
Right. That's right.
The problem was you didn't know if a review wasn't, if a product wasn't reviewed because it was bad or simply because they never got around to it.
That's right.
So the upside was if they gave it a good review, they meant it. But where it was detrimental is for the products that you didn't read about. So in other words, you didn't know.
True. That's still true today.
Well, for me, I don't know how many pieces you're reviewing, Michael, per month, but as I've mentioned it before, I only get to review 8 pieces, 4 digital, 4 analog per issue.
I products, but you review records. You mean records?
Sorry, Michael.
You mean records, not equipment.
4 records, and I don't do streaming. That's another reviewer. I do 4 LPs and 4 digital. They can be CD, SACD, Blu-ray, whatever. Right. But I buy about half of them. But Stunty, I don't distinguish between the ones that were sent as comps and the ones that I bought.
Let's talk about that, Ken. Let's talk about people who think that if you get comps that you're on the gravy train and you're corrupt.
Oh, I know that we could spend 2 hours on, because like I said, you work at McDonald's, you get a staff meal. I don't want to hear about someone who's jealous because my perks are free records. I know that when I was a car journalist, I didn't need to buy a car for months because I had cars on loan.
Right.
If you're a fashion writer, you're never going to buy a pair of shoes. I got more goddamn luggage than I'll ever need. So we are sent.
You need way more records in your life than you need cars.
True, but I have a rule. If something is sent to me, I will review it. In other words, I'm not gathering up the stuff. So if you call up Chat, if you call up MoFi, they will tell you any LP that they sent to me got reviewed.
How do you have the time? How do you have the bandwidth to do that? I cannot possibly review everything that gets sent to me. How do you do that?
But I'm sent so few, you see, Michael, because most of these labels are in the States and it costs them $40 or $50 to send a record.
I get it.
But to answer this point, basic economics and how things happen. Can you imagine back in the day when New Musical Express or Melody Maker were weekly magazines reviewing every single damned album that came out? Their editorial budget would not allow them to buy they'd go bankrupt.
That's right.
Gramophone could not buy every single classical album, and yet there wasn't a single classical release that didn't get reviewed in Gramophone. They had to be sent. So let's do some economics for the kind of people that whine at me and Michael. Some schmuck says, oh, you got a copy of this album for free. You didn't pay $39. And I say, look, schmuck, that got a quarter of a page in Hi-Fi News. That is probably $1,000 a page rate. Do you think the record label is sweating what cost them $12 when they got $1,200 worth of exposure? It's simple economics. But more to the point, and to take it away from that, because I only have 5 LPs and 5 digital discs per issue, I try to make sure of a number of things. One, it's 4 different titles. One will be jazz, one will be vintage rock, one might be world music, whatever. You can just look in Hi-Fi News to see that. I make sure that there's never 2 reviews from the same label, so I try to spread the joy there. I'm also aware of the fact that our readership is older, so I don't have to apologize for reviews of reissues. I don't really, you mentioned this before, Michael, but I don't really have to explain who Madness is because most of my readers know who they are.
What about alerting people to a bad review, a bad reissue?
If something bad came out, I would say it. But equally, if I'm getting 8 pieces, I'm never really in a position where I've got so many records that I'm going to have to choose some to discard. But the difference for me, and I don't know how this doesn't apply to you, Michael, is that we work so far ahead because we're a print title. I can actually get albums and they've sold out by the time my review appears. That's my only curse.
Yeah.
One question, please, because
just
I'm
about what Ken just said. It's like, for me, it's really important because, like, I want to ask you guys, like, now we're talking about reviewing and reviewers, but listening to you, I'm starting to make a small distinction between a reviewer and a journalist reviewer. Are you feeling me? Like, for example, like that was a good example what Ken just said. I remember getting the very first Boards of Canada 12-inch. Boards of Canada, who became now a legendary electronic band. And when I got the first 12-inch of theirs, it was 500 copies, and it was for print. So when I wrote the review, I knew that, as Ken was saying, that when it was see print, like I had to acknowledge that people would not be able to find it. It was 96 also, no internet, no Discogs, no eBay. Sure. So I started my review by, I know that statistically there's a good chance that when you're reading this, you will not be able to find this record. But now you've been told about the next one, that you should really be on the look for the next one because this band is exceptional because blah 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 blah. So you can find a use for that, which is then, in my opinion, pure journalism, of course.
Yes, and you're alerting people to good music that even if they can't get that record, they can get the next one. Yeah, that's the most fun. And breaking the band is some of the most fun you can do in this whole thing.
This is important. This is a distinction between me and Michael F. Because, Michael, you have tracking angle, you can review something the day it hits. Yep. My only reviewing is Hi-Fi News, and I'm 3 to 4 months ahead of publication. And this has caused me 2 problems. One, which I will not name the label, said, well, Ken, we're not going to send you the stuff because by the time the review comes out, it's of no value to us. Say they've done a 2,500 copy print.
Why don't you write for me, Ken? You can write for me and publish something as soon as you get the record.
Yeah,
and
Mike, you want me to pay you to let me write for you?
I'll pay you. I'll pay you. I'll pay you.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen. But the other one, I got in big trouble. Yeah, it's going to happen, Michael. I got in big trouble with readers when the very first One Step came out, which was Santana, because Mobile Fidelity was cautious, and I believe the first one was it 1,500, Michael, or 2,500?
How many they pressed? I don't remember.
It was very low, and it was
50.
actually it was sold out on announcement. By the time the review appeared, the copies were long gone and were being flipped for double on eBay.
Yeah.
And I got so many complaining emails about that.
Like it's your fault, right?
The opportunity to reply in the magazine. And Michael, I think, and Stunty, this is pretty much paraphrasing you. Even if the album has sold out, for example, I don't know how many Chad is doing of the Steely Dans. Even if it's sold out, if the review appears 6 months later or even a year later, there's a reference point there in case a copy does pop up on eBay, or you happen to go into a store that didn't sell out. It still has a use. And you were also saying that someone might pick up this magazine in 15 years.
Yeah.
Can I still stand by that review? Now, all of us can look back on things and say we might have misjudged something because
Let's talk about that. We should talk about that, about your track record of 30 or 40 years, and people go back. In 1999, you said this, and now you say this.
Well, yeah, because standards have changed. And I once reviewed a subwoofer that at the time was very good, and it was the only subwoofer of its type. And that review has haunted me because some guy said, well, I've heard it and it's not that good. What were you thinking? And Michael, I think you mentioned this before. Every reviewer has a bias. For example, I am not a bass obsessive. I am a mid-band obsessive, and my sensitivity is to sibilance. So the regular readers, and this is something that's very important, some guy who's picked up Hi-Fi News for the first time, I've been writing for them for nearly 40 years. He's not my main audience. I am not going to have to, I cannot explain myself in every single review I write, whether it's the music or the hardware. The readers that are regular readers know what to get. It's like if you go and buy a novel by John Grisham for the first time, it's pot luck. But if you've read his other previous novels, you know what to expect. So if I review a loudspeaker and I say that it's bass light, they will put that in context as to how I feel about bass. If I say the bass was overwhelming, they'll say, oh, well, Kessler's not that crazy about bass. Equally with music, when I review an album, to me, the vocals, the authenticity of the vocals actually matter more to me than the instruments. I realize it should be even. The guitar should be just as real as the voice, and the bass drum should be as real as the tuba. But we all have our priorities. And as you said before, Michael, our readers learn how to read us.
Yes.
How to use us, because otherwise we're useless. Otherwise, we are not the tools.
Yeah, I'm quite sure, Ken, those things haven't changed. Not on YouTube,
Exactly.
Not on Instagram. This is always the same. You gather your experience with a YouTube channel, with a writer, and then you try it out. And if you feel the same, you say, okay, this is my guy. I trust him now.
The same is true of wine. There are wine reviewers who say things, and you go out and buy one of these wines that they say is a 93, and it's terrible. Then you know you're not going to.
Well, we've got a major food critic in the UK. I know that if he likes a restaurant, I'm going to despise it because everyone I've gone to that he's loved has been like a sewage.
You can use it both ways. It goes in both ways, but
absolutely.
Yep.
There's a little caveat to what Michael said, which is that even if I look maybe a little younger, we're all old. I'm not sure that everyone is still like I learned the same way, exactly as you said, reading first who is writing the review. Because after a while you learn the publication. I'm not sure that's the case for most people nowadays most people don't even read reviews, let's be honest. But like for the ones who do, maybe they still follow the same good way of reading reviews. But I'm not sure. I just don't know.
Yes, but Michael 45 raised a point that we cannot escape. And again, I don't want to just sound like a grumpy old man. I'm online. I write for at least 2 or 3 online magazines. I've been using computers for 40 years. I don't want someone accusing me of techno-fear and being a dinosaur. But that analogy or that illustration I gave you before about experience, it's one thing. And I remember with the classical magazines, the gramophone had specific writers. If you had a new Berlioz, it didn't just go out to any reviewer. It went out to the reviewer who knew Berlioz inside out.
Yep.
The Beethovens went to the Beethoven expert. Now, I do not review classical for Hi-Fi News. I've got some jazz experience, but not to the same level as our regular jazz reviewer. I can review genres I'm not that particularly crazy about, like British folk. But if you give me a Fairport Convention album, I can handle it. I've been around long enough to do that. I don't want some 22-year-old telling me that Coldplay are better than the Beatles. I just don't want to hear this shit anymore. I don't want someone telling me
Sorry you ever heard it.
is even fit to collect the plectrums after Keith Richards leaves the stage. I don't want someone telling me Adele is fit to mop Aretha Franklin's brow, because it ain't the case. I had to wait 50 years to prove my father wrong, who, when the Beatles came out, he told me they were garbage, but every single one of the people he worshipped, including Frank Sinatra, including Keely Smith, covered the Beatles. They didn't cover Sinatra. So time is an inescapable arbiter of knowledge and taste. And no 20-year-old is going to tell me that Coldplay is equal to the Buffalo Springfield. They're not even equal to Tiny Tim.
Ken,
but I like getting 20-year-olds' perspective on music, though, don't you? A 20-year-old comes along and tells you what.
They're not going to tell me that they prefer Iron Brew to Sassicaia. I don't want to hear that crap.
The thing is, though, that now I put myself through okay, so I started doing this for a little over 30 years now, and since the beginning of the internet, since the beginning of the internet, in an efficient way where you could listen to stuff online, etc. Every week, because I come from a journalistic perspective, I make a point of listening to everything that comes out on vinyl. Vinyl is my limit. There's much more that comes out. I know it's not possible to process it. Just to listen to everything that comes out on vinyl, like online, it already takes me about 20 hours a week of just listening to audio clips, even for 5 seconds. Because let's be honest, most of the tracks of whatever pop music, like you only need to listen to the beginning if you like the sound aesthetic of it, and then you go to the middle just to be proven right or wrong about it, if there's a continuation of the greatness or the debacle that was the first 2 seconds of the song.
Yeah.
How often have you been wrong about something where you dismissed it and then it becomes really
almost never.
Really?
But, like,
Good for you.
But, no, but because now I'm talking, when we talk about not jazz, not classical music, not avant-garde, when stuff could happen. But if it's a rap song, a pop song, a rock song, usually, I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions, but there would be the exceptions. But you guys,
I dismissed Roxy music when it first came out. I dismissed Roxy music. It took me a little bit of time, but I dismissed it. And someone said, "Sit down and let me explain this to you." And but I said,
well, I started with more history in the rear view than you, so I had to be humble.
Yes, you had to catch up. As I said, you had to catch up.
Yeah,
because you had the disadvantage. Michael and I were like 10 or 12 or 13 years old when the Beatles came out. You weren't even born.
Maybe so, but when I was 13 in 1990, I was doing a fake fanzine to get in for free to see Nirvana.
Okay.
So, and that was luck in a way, but there's no luck. You learn after a while. Like
absolutely. But you see, each of us has our own story as to why we are in this business.
Yeah.
Now, my curse is that I don't know how to play an instrument. But equally, I don't have a guilt trip about that, because when I was writing about wine, I don't know how to press grapes.
Exactly.
I've reviewed restaurants. I can cook, but I can't make a souffle. So, it's like every sport critic isn't
very funny what you just said, because I actually know how to press a record, and you're the guys focusing on the sound. When
people like Michael and myself will actually bother to go and find out how it's done.
We've been impressed. I've been impressed with all over the world, so I know how we know how it's done. We know
about cutting heads. We know about Westrex versus order.
We have to know that.
It's made me understand one thing that is quite interesting, which is like a distinction. Because while you were saying about the whole thing, like, no, the people who think that you get a bias because you get sent free records. Yeah. If I'm being honest with myself, and I'm totally always about that, I know I have a small bias when I get a record for free. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to do a proper, good, professional review, but I know 100%. I have to acknowledge that it's not exactly the same than when I have actually sorted the record myself. But then you made me understand why. Because if you are actually coming from a journalistic music journalist perspective, then you will have that issue. If you are coming from the perspective that you very well described, like the music is already known, now I'm judging the record for its technical qualities, then it might be easier to actually not have that bias, even if you get it for free.
Well, I got sent the George Harrison All Things Must Pass deluxe box set, the recent one. And it was terrible. And I wrote it was terrible. And I didn't care that it was sent to me. And I didn't care. I wasn't worried that Universal would not send me anything else after that, or I would have set the George Harrison family. It was badly done. And so I wrote that. And that's
I'm the flip side of that, because I bought both.
This whole discussion.
One question, but I actually quite like
this whole discussion about getting free samples for doing a review. Has this already been when you're just doing newspapers, or is this also a new topic that people discuss this? That you get a free copy. I totally don't get this.
There's always going to be someone. It's one of the many types of trolls. And Michael mentioned earlier, and also Stunty, this also answers your question. If you're going to be a reviewer, whether it's online, in print, doesn't matter where, you're putting yourself out there, and you have to have thick skin. You have to be prepared for critics. Now, and we love it. If I give a good review to something and someone says, you must have been listening with cloth ears, I think this, that, and the other sounded crap. If you're caught out, you're caught out. And if you're an honest journalist, you put your hands up, because I made a mistake. I had in 2 reviews. One, I said that in the band's recording, it was a Jew's harp. It wasn't a Jew's harp. It was a synthetic. It was a synthesizer. And it fooled me into thinking it was a Jew's harp on the band's second album. And another one I got, because I was probably writing too fast, I mentioned the wrong instrument. And I held my hand up, and everyone got a good laugh at it in the pages of the magazine. If you make a mistake, you will be caught out. Now, I said earlier, yeah, but that's the whole beauty of this, is that it shows that we're human. And when last week, when all this stuff came out about algorithms that are going to kill our careers because they're going to write the reviews for us, and you're going to have some algorithm that writes your review, they're not going to be foolproof. They're not going to bring to it Michael saying, well, I got 7 different pressings of that. I can assure you that asshole in Apple doesn't have 7 pressings of that album. And that asshole didn't see that band live. So I don't care what algorithms they come up with. And we have our experience to fall back on. Luckily, we both have good hearing. We get our hearing tested. We take care of our ears. For 50 years, I have avoided certain concerts or walked out of concerts because I do not want punctured eardrums. Ironically, the loudest, noisiest, worst concerts I've ever been to were gigs at CES, where you had an audience full of people from the hi-fi industry.
Yes.
And they had to hand out, and also at
Montreal. That was Noah Lee trying to make everybody in the industry deaf.
Most known one. It was so and Steve Miller Band and Fleetwood Mac were so loud that I had to roll up tissues and put them in my ears, and I had to laugh my ass off at Montreal Jazz Festival. They handed out earplugs.
Yes,
they handed out earplugs.
Yes,
and I had an SPL meter on my phone. I'm 100 meters away, and it's 118 dB. Give me strength. So
it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But can I tell you a funny story? So talking about mistakes and what records have on them. The Bridge Over Troubled Water, the master tape of the song Bridge Over Troubled Water was lost almost immediately after that was originally released. Every reissue afterwards has a later tape. And Roy Halley told me he's heard every single reissue. He heard, the one-step MoFi. He heard classic records, 45 RPM. He said, Michael, none of them sound the right right, that track is wrong. You have to get an original, because the tape disappeared almost as soon as the record was pressed. And so a reader got in touch with me after he got the MoFi one step, and he said, "This is so good. You can hear that the strings on the song Bridge Over Troubled Water was actually synthesizers. You can now finally hear that." I said, "No, what you're hearing finally, it's such a good representation of what's on that tape. You're hearing that the tape isn't very good. That's what you're hearing." And it blew his mind. Just that song, not the whole record.
But you see, this is the kind of knowledge that reviewers like Michael bring to the table, because if you have someone who's, and again, I don't want to be ageist, but some 25-year-old is not going to have the context for reviewing James Brown at the Apollo. Someone who's 25 years old is not going to have the context for reviewing mid-1960s Miles Davis albums. Now, God knows what's going to happen 50 years
the
from now.
context of a 25-year-old. This also might be quite interesting.
Michael, Ken, I understand exactly what
I like the 25-year-old's perspective. I'd like the 25-year-old's
perspective. It can be interesting, but like it would be for something else. I have 30 years of experience, and I realize like it's like if someone would say to me that it's not that I do this for a living, is that I live for this, in the sense that I actually, you might have a good opinion. The thing is that, like, how much music do you listen each year? I listen to about 20,000 new records a year. That doesn't make me better than you. It just makes me statistically, I have more reference points. And I've had that for 30 years, maybe, or at least 20 plus good experience even before. Which brings an important point about two important points about the future, which is that music journalism is a young man's job. Why? Because there's no money in it. So there's very few people like us who can sustain this length that Ken is talking about, that can build this experience over 30, 40 years of like bridging the knots, like putting the story together, because you understand this because you were either there or you met the right person and you have continuity. But at the same time, what I think this experience is the most valuable is not necessarily to talk about the past, because as Michael Fremer was saying, I'm also interested in the perspective of a 25-year-old. But because of these 30 years, 40 of experience, what I'm most interested in is the music of today that is actually of tomorrow. And why is it of tomorrow? Because I don't know how to understand hyper digital cumbia from Nigeria. But because of all my experience, and remember, one of our job is also to find the words that leave the least amount of interpretation when we talk about this most abstract thing that is music. So if you have that talent that you built over the years and that culture, maybe, just maybe, that gives you an edge on other people to actually understand the stuff that you yourself are not even ready to understand. But
that's such a good point. That is such a good point. So I've got a 17-year-old guy writing for me who's brilliant, and his perspective on music, he likes a lot of the old things that we like, but he has these new things that he likes that at first I go, I don't like that. And then he'll sit me down and he'll teach me why it's good. And sometimes I won't agree with him, but sometimes I will agree. And I'll say, you know what, I got into that. And that's, some of these artists that I just would never have thought about liking. I'd listen to it and dismiss it, and he would explain why it was good. And then I would say, I listened to it again, and you're right. Like Tyler, the Creator. Tyler, the Creator is great as far as I'm concerned, but I didn't.
But Stunty, you brought up there's a couple of subjects in there that need addressing. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier was back in the day, and still to this day, probably for classical, if you have a new recording of, say, Gershwin, now Bernstein did the definitives, but say someone bothers for whatever reason to do a new performance, even though Gershwin's were virtually perfect, you will have a specific reviewer that's going to handle that. I don't care what a 21-year-old says about it. I care what the Gershwin expert says about it. It's a big difference there. Now, the most frightening thing for me is what the term called living history. And right now, something that's very close to my heart, because of my cultural background, is the Holocaust. And within the next 10 years, there probably will not be one Holocaust survivor still alive, which means that anything written after the last survivor dies is going to be fantasy.
But there'll be new Holocausts.
It's
Ken. There are new Holocausts coming all the time in this world. So
No, I'm talking about that specific one.
It was a bad joke. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just talking about that specific one, and
Art is there to remind us of history.
It's about living memory. The other night, I saw a documentary on Jackie Stewart, and Jackie Stewart is talking about all of the Formula One drivers that died before the safety rules changed in Grand Prix racing. When his generation's gone, it's just going to be dead history as opposed to living history.
Yeah.
What I hate to think is that, and we're going through this right now, is I hate more than anything is revisionism. Last week they came out and they said they're going to change the language in the James Bond books. The James Bond books were written from 1952-53 onward. I don't want that modernized. I don't want him turned into a trans lesbian. This is ridiculous.
It is. I agree. It's the worst thing possible.
Michael, it also applies to our field as well. And I can't, and it bothers me.
You mean like taking Paul McCartney's cigarette off the Abbey Road cover?
Well, that kind of thing. Well, they took it off the Compound Me Love picked sleeve as well back in '64. But what I mean is that you are going to start getting revisions and rewriting of history. And I can't remember which artist it was. But
what about remixes, Ken? Is remixing revision of history? That's
well, that too. But at least it's identified. They're not lying about it. And if you want the original, you can get the original.
Yeah.
But a few weeks ago, one of these loudmouth online so-called experts was badmouthing a song that he had only known the cover of, and it was something like Van Halen, "You Really Got Me," and the idiot was criticizing the Kinks. Now, I am sorry. He has every right to prefer the Van Halen version, but for God's sake, do your fucking homework. And I am so tired of this stuff, because if you point this stuff out, you're the one that's wrong, because facts have been replaced by opinions.
Yes.
And Stunty, this gets back to what we're talking about. Now, I cannot say that this
Wait, Ken,
album.
I'll let you go, but did I say something that you object to? Because so far,
no, I'm not objecting to it. I'm not objecting.
Ken's a good self-starter. It's not. He's not reacting. He's self.
No, it's certainly.
I think it's because I read the comments as well, and like it's good.
I don't see. How come I'm not seeing any comments? I don't see any comments.
I haven't seen any comments yet, but I have to say,
why not?
That because we've got this movement now of the post-millennial, whatever age group it is, where their opinions are as important as facts. I'm sorry. And I think back to The Big Lebowski, when the dude would say, well, that's just your opinion. I'm sorry. Facts are facts and opinions are opinions.
Yes.
You can have any opinion you like, but a fact is a fact. And on November 22nd, 1963, or I think it was that the date, Kennedy was assassinated. Yes. Don't tell me it happened in October, because you're a fucking liar. And unfortunately, an opinion is a lie if you're presenting it as a fact.
Yeah,
and that's just irrefutable. And I'm going to probably get trolled.
Are you really seeing that much right now in professional reviewing?
Oh yeah, you kidding?
No, like mistakes. I agree, but like
no, it's presented as fact. It's presented as fact.
I don't see a lot of that, so maybe it's because I don't read.
Remember when we started this stream? I think it was Michael Fremmer. He put up some points of a good reviewer, and one of the points, it was the last point. You have to be entertaining. I think that was the last point you said.
Yeah,
but I think nowadays, with today's media, this entertainment factor gets more and more and more important.
Yes.
And I think the opinion is sometimes more entertaining than the simple and sometimes boring fact.
Yeah, but that answers this particularly. I know, and Michael knows, that what we get paid for in money, forget the free records, what we get paid for is by the word for what we write. When I see something online, I don't know if that influencer, and even though by law they're supposed to announce it now, like at the bottom it's supposed to say this brand supplied all these cosmetics, or this brand supplied. I was given a free meal in this restaurant.
Yep.
When some guy goes banging on about some new artist, I don't know if it's his brother-in-law. I don't know if he was slipped $5K by the record label.
Exactly.
Because the dishonesty of most of the online people. Look, almost 20 years ago, Michael's editor, Bob Harley, told me when I was in a lather about some troll, he said, Ken, don't reply to this schmuck. Why are you writing to you to reply to him is you're writing for free. And he said he was absolutely right. He wants my opinion. He can buy Hi-Fi News. Now, the thing is, and Stunty, you've pointed out the difference between a reviewer and a journalist. Michael and I have to do both because Michael, you do have your own outlet as well. But when Michael writes for the Absolute Sound and I write for Hi-Fi News, we have responsibilities to our magazines. And one thing that came out very early on in the days of social media and the internet is this. If I say something libelous, or Michael writes something libelous, or even erroneous or offensive, you can find my editor. You can find Michael's editor because we're bricks and mortar and words on paper. You try nailing someone who's coming via a server in Istanbul. The stuff that gets released online and there is no comeback and you can do nothing about it. And that's endemic. And unfortunately, this also refers back to things like rewriting James Bond and rewriting Roald Dahl. Michael, you were right to point out that someone remastering, not just remastering, but remixing an album, what are they doing? Number one, if it's with the artist's approval, you got no argument. But number two, made clear. So I don't consider it dishonest.
Right.
The whole thing that started all of this.
And tell people if it's what the source is. Tell people what the source is that they're giving you. Is it original tape?
Is about disclosure. And you said it was Stunty before we started the cameras rolling. If the disclosure is there, you have no grounds for complaint because you were told what it was.
In reality, it can be more difficult than that. Like, so I was writing mostly for this magazine in France, and at one point I became one of the lead journalists, and there are, as you said, press agents who are journalists but who are in reality press agents. The records that you get sent, it's because a label or an artist needs you. So there's already like a different dynamic than just the journalistic one. The problem I faced, and that you should face as a journalist, is that your responsibility is not towards your publisher, but towards your reader. And of course, that creates a problem in your own economy, because sometimes I was assigned a review, like the star reviewer, blah, 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 and the review comes out negative. So they don't publish it because I didn't know, because it's not my job. It's not my responsibility to know that there was actually a partnership between the finance guy of the magazine and the label. And that happens all the time. So
does it?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Like
it doesn't happen with me. I can tell you, it doesn't happen.
There's no reason it would happen with you, Michael. I think, but for new music in most publications, you could think that it doesn't mean that it's 100% pay content, but like the label will buy advertising. That's how it works. It's always like that. And if you do a bad review of that, why should they continue to advertise the record that in the same pages you actually say this record is actually not good because blah blah blah? It makes zero sense. Everyone can see that, and I understand that. So I understand that the job of a music journalist in our day and age, when I believe that, and that goes to a larger degree, I think that the industry of entertainment is using stuff like what we are doing right now, YouTube, the social media, so that everyone can become a critic. And now they give some money, some residual money to everyone who does that in an effective way. But when the result of that is that it kills professional critics totally because there's no economy in it anymore, then do you really think they will bother giving the small money they are currently giving to everyone? I might be wrong, but I have my suspicions about that.
Look, no one is going to argue, especially Michael and myself. The issues of freedom of the press are sacrosanct. There was a big problem in the UK some years ago when someone criticized a yacht, a sailboat, new technology, and he was every right to criticize it, but because it went to court, there was a lawsuit, and it made all those reviewers afraid to criticize that. Again, I have to go back to this thing about fact versus opinion, and I can see from the comments that people saying that I'm going to be canceled. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm entitled to an opinion too, and you don't have to listen to me. You want to cancel me? Fine. I'm 70. The rest of my life is being canceled at 20, I'm sure, is far worse than being canceled at 70, and I can live with it. Michael and I sleep at night because we know we're not on the take. Despite all of these guys whining about us getting review samples, we explained in the first part of the show that the whole way these businesses have to work. Let's take it away from this for another second. Do you think any car magazine could go out and buy every car it has to review, let alone rent it? The finances and the economic models simply do not exist. Another comment.
There's a better way to explain that, Ken.
Sorry?
I think there's an even clearer way to explain that. Like, I come from a different perspective, and I understand fully yours, which is if you come from something that is less subjective as what I most of the time do, which is actually music. When you insert a large part what is technical and factual about it, then there's no reason for you to say one thing or the other, but the truth of what you feel.
But it still gets challenged, you see. This is what the worry is. Like I said, because of recent developments in culture and society, the lines are blurring between fact and opinion. This was never an issue. Even things like pronouns, if you want to be called they or it, mazel tov. But to me, you are of a specific gender. I don't think I have to change just because you want that. My personal pronoun is my liege. You don't like it, don't call me that. But the thing is, Michael and I, in fact, Michael, I think you might agree.
Michael, say for yourself a little bit.
Among all the hi-fi reviewers, Michael and I, as much as any, are under close scrutiny because we've been around for so long. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm an audio god or Michael's an audio god, but we've been published a lot. I've written books. Michael's done liner notes. I can't even count how many you've done. We are there. And early on, within a couple of years of me arriving, and I'm sure it happened to you, Michael, the resentment started coming out from audiophiles that wish they had our job. Now, I can think of 100 jobs. I'd love to be a food critic. I'd like to be eating at a Michelin restaurant every single day, but that's not the path my career took. Now, Michael and I would not be where we are if we didn't understand music, if we didn't know music, if we didn't have a history behind us. Michael and I did not start reviewing hi-fi before we had our first system.
Can I interrupt you for a second? When I first started reviewing hi-fi, I wrote for the Absolute Sound as a music critic. And I wanted to review hi-fi. And I wrote a review of a pair of loudspeakers and sent it to Harry Pearson, who started the magazine, who some of you don't know is like a legendary guy. He's not dead now. And I sent that review back 10 times. And he red penciled it and sent it back. It went back and forth and back and forth. And I learned how to write a review by having someone teach me. That doesn't exist anymore. Now it's whoever wants to start writing reviews, start a website. Companies will send you products and you start reviewing. And people don't know what they're doing and they're writing reviews. It's ridiculous.
Michael, you said at the beginning that 12 people are writing for you. Are those all masters with a master degree, or how do you choose them?
You go and read Joe Washek's review of the Lester Young record that Sam put out. Read that review. This guy is a brilliant writer. And
I agree because I read it, but you know,
it's not a matter of having a master's degree; it's a matter of expressing, showing knowledge. That's why
I asked so distinctive, because it sounded a little bit like that. Because I work together with a lot of young people, and in reality, in my advertising agency, there is not often such a huge difference between the guys with the master and the bachelor, or just street smart, or there is not that often such a huge difference between a 30-year-old and a 50-year-old or 60-year-old. I think it always depends on the person. And
But
I think you cannot
yeah,
generalize.
That's why
yeah, I've just been scrolling through the comments, and by the way, Michael 45, there's one viewer said we're not answering some of the questions that are coming through, so maybe you might want to feed us some of those. But one thing
I want to suggest that I don't want to interrupt you because you were in a nice flow.
Michael
well,
45, you should feel free.
I will put now.
I'm trying not to be distracted by the comments because we have our conversation going on, but I don't want to disrespect the viewers. But
Right.
No, me neither. Me neither. So now officially, from now on, we will have a close eye on the comments. I will do that. I will put them on. And,
as our moderator, thank you. You take the pressure off us. But what I was about to say, this is again about qualifications and things like I'm 70. The world out there, I'm past it. My career is at its end. And one of the comments was a 22-year-old doesn't care about my opinion. Sorry, dude, I'm not writing for 22-year-olds.
But many do. I have lots of young readers who do care.
Look, if
they're smart people, they don't.
No, if they come along, mazel tov. But what I know from the way I was brought up and the way I entered my career, I hung on to every single word I ever heard from my elders and my mentors. I don't know if it's generational. I don't know if it's the way I was brought up. But when I met a hi-fi guy and I was 30 and this guy was 60 and he had 40 years behind him making fantastic amplifiers, I hung on to every word from David Haffler. I hung on to every word from Stanley Kelly and Peter Walker. And that's what I was stealing knowledge from them. And I'd like to think that I have been able to process that and pass that on. Now, if I didn't anger people, I would be disappointed in myself, because another legendary audiophile named Harvey Rosenberg said, Ken, it's better to go through life hated than ignored.
That's true. I agree.
And Michael,
should I answer that question? Should I answer that question?
Yeah, answer the question.
I think go into the critical question from Mike from the Jazz Bums.
Should I answer that question? Jazz Bums, Mike?
Yes,
can everybody see the question, or should I repeat the question?
Everybody can see it, and it has been up for quite some time.
So
I think
if you hear a record that's you think is worthy of being reissued that people don't know about, and you have access to people that reissue records, I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, hey, you should consider reissuing this record. And that's why Chad reissued the Ellington masterpieces. And I'm so glad he did, because that's one of the greatest records ever made, ever, musically and sonically. And when people discover it, it's so great. And young people discover that record. It's one of the greatest records. I'm happy that I told Chad that he should reissue that. Chad didn't have to reissue it because I said you should do it. But I don't think that's a problem. There's other problems involved with dealing with manufacturers and reissue people.
Well, Michael, it raises. Sorry,
I wanted to point out to what Ken was saying, something that, like, historically, music journalism and reviewing, there's something that we haven't really tackled that is not necessarily a counterpoint to what you're saying, Ken, but that is also another perspective. Is a lot of historically the greatest music journalists, it was only a case of being there at the right time at the right place.
Well, that's true with everything about where you are at a given time.
That a 22-year-old, if he's in the right place at the right moment, he might kickstart the greatest music journalist career.
Well, there's another topic that we probably may not get into in this session, but it's like we don't know which 22-year-old today is going to be a legendary reviewer that people are reading 100 years from now. We don't know that. That's why I'm not completely dismissive of it. And in fact, in my other career of writing about watches, there's all sorts of tiny little brands have come along. And it was a problem we always had in hi-fi. Too many brands, not enough customers. But what you don't know is which one of these new brands is going to be the next Rolex. Oh, there's another question that's come up, Michael, about vintage. Can I take this
maybe
one?
as Michael Fremer did the Ellington, Ken go into this one. And then
people
that
know my stuff know that my special area is I'm a hi-fi historian, and I've written 4 or 5 brand histories. And right now, it's interesting that this gentleman mentioned, I'm guessing it's a gentleman, the vintage TD-124 and Quad 2s seem to love 50s and 60s records. That is a school of thought that Japanese audiophiles are the leaders in believing, that say, if you have a record from 1965, you really do want to hear it on a system from 1965, because I can promise you that when Jimi Hendrix's albums were released in '68, there are photos of him playing it on a garage turntable through whichever speakers it was.
Yeah.
And my latest revelation in hi-fi is a loudspeaker company called Devore, and talking to the distributor in the UK, it was like being thrown back to 1968, because there was a sound, and I also discussed this with a mutual friend of Michael and mine, JJ French, that Michael and I were teenagers then, and that's when we got our first systems, and there's a romance and a nostalgia. And I also think the sound systems of the 50s and 60s were less aggressive, although less dynamic, than the current stuff.
And way more colored, way more colored.
Way more colored. But the pleasure is, and Stunty, this goes to your sensibilities. If you get more pleasure out of a system with slightly colored sound than more accurate, go for it. If you like a drier red than I do, go for it. This, again, I'm not double track, backpedaling on my opinions about age differences and experience, because the bottom line is what you like is what matters the most to you. And one of the comments was, this guy was saying he loves the George Harrison box, so he disagrees with Mikey and he agrees with me. That's perfectly acceptable. The only thing I'm screaming and ranting about is messing with facts.
Yes.
Opinions, you can do whatever you like.
Of course, that's exactly right.
As the saying goes, you know this old saying, Michael.
We all have, I guess we all have our pet peeves. For me, like for the people who follow me, who trust my judgment or whatever, or who actually use it as an opposite of what they want,
Right.
I know that, like, I have a tendency. I'll give you an example. There's an artist called Markus Schmickler who was doing like modern electronic krautrock in the early 90s. He's a great artist of experimental avant-garde music. And 2 years ago or last year, he released an album that I heard it and I instantly, this is actually really, I don't like it. Like, these sounds are horrible. And it makes me uncomfortable and then I thought, like, shit, an album that can have that effect on me, that's actually interesting. And then, of course, I read more, and that was actually the intention. Like, he designed tones that were like basically Guantanamo Bay prison tones. So I'm always looking for music that is, in different ways, challenging,
Disruptive.
Exactly. I appreciate the Beatles also because I understand the context that back then they were disruptive. They were the most disruptive pop band
in history.
In history, or back then at least, because they don't exist now. So now it's going to be someone else. And I just don't want to be the one who misses the new Beatles. The new Beatles is never going to be as successful commercially or mediatically as the Beatles, because now everything is diluted media-wise and everyone has an opinion. But that doesn't change that, like, music theory, music history, like groundbreaking ideas, disruptive ideas. To be able to identify these, you really need to forget yourself a little bit, but you also need, as we all agree on, that le socle, this background of knowledge. But that's my pet peeve, and I fully acknowledge that most people seek music just for pleasure, entertainment, relaxation, and that's perfectly acceptable. I have my paradigm, and I try to be honest with it for me and for my audience. And that's the best I can do.
But one thing we seem to be avoiding or skirting, and this sort of relates to the point that was raised earlier. If you're just starting a career as a reviewer, and you've got all that history you really ought to catch up on. In other words, if you're going to become a rock reviewer, you can't just ignore the previous 6 decades. But the field is so huge now that we are ultimately going to end up the way classical did, which had a 300-400 year lead on us. As we've mentioned a couple times earlier, every classical reviewer magazine or website has a specialist for each composer, and it has to. It has one guy that just does the choral stuff, another one that just does opera.
You know, I don't know if I agree with that, Ken, because, for example, I love Beethoven, but I'm not a Beethoven specialist. I'm not a classical music specialist, but I know what I like. I did a video on Beethoven box sets that I have, about 8 of them, and I was very hesitant to do it because I'm not an expert, but I did it for people who are not into classical music, and to try to get them into classical music from the perspective of someone who is not an expert, because the experts tend to be very dry and they just do it in a way that it doesn't welcome new people in. I did this video.
That's
it got 60,000 views, and people who didn't know Beethoven were like encouraged to buy a Beethoven box, and now they like Beethoven. So there's different perspectives to bring to everything. The experts are the experts for the people who need to have the expert person talking.
But Michael, but that's ignoring the one other thing, which is the audience. The people reading the gramophone are not novices to classical.
I said I'm a dinosaur. Okay.
The people that turn to the gramophone or another classical music magazine are not novices.
That's
right. The people that pick up the absolute sound are not buying their first ever pair of headphones. Okay. If I buy a magazine about wine, and I only read about Italian red wines, I want the Italian red wine expert to be reviewing this bottle. What you're saying, I agree, because you, Michael, I tip my hat to you. You do as much as you can to bring new people into it. I've gone the other extreme, and I was saying before about specializing. I totally respect, even though I have no chops in classical, the idea that my editor for music at Hi-Fi News, who is a classical genius, has no time for opera. He just does. It's just not part of his realm. He hands that over to someone else.
Right.
I would not dream of reviewing, if I were doing, this is for you, Stunty, if I were reviewing the music and not the sound, you do not give me techno, you do not give me Kraftwerk, you do not give me prog rock, because these are not my areas. But you give me West Coast, you give me 50s musical Broadway or soundtracks and stuff, that I'm more comfortable with. And I believe that because rock, pop, jazz are now so huge that with jazz, if I ran a jazz magazine, I'd want one guy that does bebop, one guy that does freeform, one guy that does Latin, because the people that pay $7 or $10 for a magazine are not newcomers. They want expert opinions, not.
But Ken, 1 second, because you're always, Santi, wait a second, please. You always emphasize experience, and I totally get that. There is very few things that are more valuable than experience, but there is another factor, and another factor might be something like, I do that in my agency business quite often, fresh eyes. You know.
Sure.
If you do your one second, just finishing this thought. When you do it every day for 20 years, you do the bebop section, you have an invaluable experience. But you have one thing for sure, not fresh eyes and a different perspective. And this can be very valuable and very entertaining even for experienced readers, in my personal opinion.
I agree with that.
Sorry.
Yeah, because I would be shocked if you didn't agree with that. Like, with what you're saying, I believe you said something that you could play the devil's advocate with yourself, because if I listening to you, you could, I think that a lot of people could hear that before you start doing that work, that job, you would need to do the work, building the knowledge.
Absolutely.
The thing is that I think that we still would all agree that all of us and all the greatest music journalists of late, I would say Simon Reynolds, who used to work for the Melody Maker, he's probably one of the greatest writers of 80s, 90s, and 2000 music. We all started because we were there when it was happening and when it was relevant. So we didn't. I didn't start by learning about post-punk from the 80s, rock from the 70s, Stockhausen from the 50s. I started because I was there when Nirvana was starting. I was there when techno was starting, around where, and I built from that. I think that every music journalist or reviewer starts with when they have the passion, when something they discover, or they are the one to identify something that is now, and then they pursue it, and they get enough time, or they dedicate enough time to find the context of that. And I think, like,
I'm not disagreeing with that at all.
I know
I'm
you are
saying
not.
is,
But what you were saying could let think that you would need to build that experience of like history, or that knowledge of history, before you even start writing. And I'm sure, like, because you're a smart guy, so I know that like the perspective can be a little bit different. And when you said about the people who read classical magazine, that they are experienced in a way, but does that mean that they shouldn't be exposed, for example, to Michael Harrison, modern classical music, who used to be the guy who tuned the piano of La
no, they
Monte?
would be. That would be reviewed, and it would be reviewed
No,
by
it wouldn't, because this came out as a 300 copy a record on an indie label that is not even distributed in the
Well, then
US.
that's a bad example, because it's not going to come to become the magazines are not going to be aware of it. You
Yeah,
can't
that
hold
doesn't
that
mean
up.
that it's
You
not.
can't hold that up as an exemplar if it's not accessible. You
No, but
have
the thing
that's
is,
dodge.
it is accessible. Ken, it is accessible on other formats. It is the
Perhaps.
music still exists.
Look, there's the old sayings that cream rises to the top. The corollary is that shit floats. But the point is if and we can start talking about philosophy. If a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, did it fall? That's not the good example. A newcomer coming to Gramophone or Classical FM magazine or whatever, who's never ever learned the language of classical music. I know the first time I picked up a wine magazine, I didn't know the language. You acquire it over time. I'm not saying that no one can write about rock music unless they're 90 years old and were there and when Jerry Lee Lewis was making his first record, but you have to be aware of it. And that example I gave about the editor of a magazine not knowing who Chuck Berry is, that to me is fundamental. I'm not saying that you have to listen to every single record ever made. That's ludicrous. My solution was you specialize and you know what you like. You came along and you said it was around the arrival of techno. My scene came, my awareness of music came when the Beatles released their first album. But even though I was only 12, music was always playing in my house. So I had my father's taste, which was big band and soundtracks. My sister was 6 years older, so I knew all about Elvis Presley. And fortunately, I absorbed that stuff. So I am, Glenn Miller was dead long before I ever took a breath, but I can talk about him and I know who he is. I know how big he was.
Ken, who were the writers when you were growing up? Did you read other reviewers? Like, did you?
Absolutely.
Who influenced you?
Steve Simons.
I fought with him all the time, Steve Simons.
I know you did. Greil Marcus. I read because I was of the age when the serious rock critics started coming out as opposed to fan magazines.
Like for jazz, Gene Lee. Do you know Gene Lee's? Gene Lee's.
I know the name.
Yeah, Gene Lee's. I got so much good music reading Hi-Fi Stereo Review from Gene Lee's jazz record.
But Michael, you just pointed out what I wanted to say to Stunty. Before I ever wrote a word, I had been a voracious reader for at least 10 years before I submitted my first article. And my first article was printed because it was good enough so that at the age of 22 or whatever it was, I wrote a review for one of the most respected rock magazines going. And that's because I wasn't so precocious or pretentious or obnoxious as to think that every word that came out of my mouth 10 years earlier. When I bought my first Beatles album, I wasn't informed, but 10 years later and 600 LPs later and being in 3 bands later, I was then ready to write. And thank God I had majored in English so I could also construct a sentence.
I'll tell you an example, like if we go to the music making. I made music, I've released stuff, and I had a few crises in my music making. I have friends who are still in the music business and successful artists. The very first stuff they did, they released. Me, I was like you with writing. Like I waited 10 years to be sure. Can I stand by that in 10 years? Well, guess how many records these guys did, and guess how many I did. They did much more than me. So there is, I think what you say worked for you, and
Yes,
it's for your readers. And there are also statistically going to be people who start at 22 or at 18 or at 17 just because they were so close to the pulse of something new that they would be the one who would be, and they would be smart enough to not start to believe that they can talk about Elvis or Black Elvis or whatever. They would just
yes, but again, we're losing sight of what I was talking about before, which is the difference between opinions and facts. I don't, like I said before, if someone prefers the Van Halen version to the Kinks version, mazel tov. I'm happy for them to do that, and they can probably spend all night trying to tell me why I should prefer Eddie Van Halen to Dave Davis. I get that. It's the facts that bother me. It's changing the facts. And
Yeah, but
I don't know
I'm
if that's really important anymore in reviewing music or reviewing, because Michael, I think you'll agree with me. And we had this with the comments about some people hate the George Harrison box and agree with Michael. Some people love it and agree with me. There is no, I hate to say this because Harry Pearson was one of the mentors, but there is no absolute sound. For one reason, we all hear differently. For another, we have biases. Some people love horn speakers. Some people like electrostatic speakers. Stunty, you prefer vinyl? I know people that hate vinyl, love CD, and I wouldn't try to talk them out of it. There are people who think I'm completely off my rocker for loving open reel tape. I'm not arguing against opinion, bias, taste, whatever. I just
we all have enough experience to know that this kind of things that we have
and this is very.
Can we pause for a joke? I have one quick joke I'd like to tell that people would like. So Paul Klipsch and Amar Bose meet on the street. Do you know this joke? Paul Klipsch and Amar Bose meet on the street, and Paul Klipsch goes, "Hey, Amar, how you doing?" And Amar goes, "I'm doing great, Paul. How are you?" That's not.
But that's a very, you've got to be an audiophile to get that.
That's right.
You've got to be a hardcore audiophile to get that.
But beautiful that you made this break, Michael. Because I have
the original basis.
One second. Because there is one thing in the room, and that came clearer and clearer to me while listening to all of you. What is the big change nowadays? Because again, young people experience, but if you see, how does it feel to you when nowadays 20-old makes a video title listening the first time to the Rolling Stones, and they get 21 million views?
God
what
bless
has changed? Is there a change? How? Yeah, I knew. Now let's get a little bit deeper. What does that mean, and how does it feel for someone who puts his lifetime into this work of reviewing?
Michael, you go first.
You go first.
Okay. I've got a bit of a conflict here, because one of my favorite TikTok sites is this British actor named Nathan Brown. And I don't know, Nathan looks like he's in his 30s, and he's there with headphones, and it's like hearing such and such for the first time. Every once in a while I'll say, I actually know this song, but it'll be something like hearing Genesis for the first time or hearing Pink Floyd for the first time. And his reactions are hysterical because he just grooves with it. And without profiling him, the music is not what you would expect him to like. Okay, it's like me suddenly going crazy over the Spice Girls. It's just not something you're going to expect. But equally, what bothers me about all of this, it's not the wild frontier and some kid 20 years old getting 20 million hits. It's still the fact that there's no filter, that there's no arbiter for the quality of it. And it's like the last defense of print journalism is that you have to go through an editor. And partly it ensures the quality of writing. Now, that's another whole topic about how the quality of speech and writing are deteriorating because kids use texting instead of writing properly. That's just evolution of the language. I'm not, you just deal with it.
Yep.
But again, if I'm going to take an hour to read an article or a half hour to read an article, I want that article to be from someone who's qualified, who's an expert, and Michael, to answer your question, and to be entertained as well, because I want it to be legible, entertaining. I don't want it to just be bone dry. And I want to walk away from that article learning something or gaining something. And Stunty, just so you don't think that I'm living in some cave with no Wi-Fi.
No, I'm just like...
I do hear new music every week, and I am turned on by some of it. But what I don't approve of or appreciate or want to accept is when one of the commentaries or one of the critics or one of the writers is acting like something is brand new when you know it's derivative.
Totally.
And that's where that history comes. Yeah. So when
that happened to us too. A lot of what we heard that we thought was brand new was
no, Michael. The Beatles never hid the fact that they worshipped Motown or that they worshipped Carl Perkins. And if you bought an album and there was a cover, you saw that the songwriter, oh, I didn't know that Buddy Holly wrote Words of Love. It wasn't hidden, and there was no one telling you that the Beatles wrote Words of Love. Like these schmucks who telling me that Van Halen wrote.
But the kids listening to it, a lot of kids listening would not have known that.
Oh no, it was the Beatles who turned me on to Buddy Holly. God bless him.
Right.
It was, but this was our generation, Michael, where we had the.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when Buddy Holly died, and that affected me.
Well, me too. But when the British bands came along, and we're in the States, and they're feeding back to us what we should have appreciated. It's because of the British that I love the blues, and it's because of the British that I love Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran.
That's what the Stones did.
I was 7 years old when Buddy Holly died. He was my sister's generation. And thank God that I read liner notes and I read Beatles 6 and I saw.
What are liner notes? That's the problem.
Well, yeah, this is another story. But that's where my.
What are liners?
That's my education was liner notes.
Yeah.
I would like to try to answer Michael though about like what has changed. So Ken, like it's about like you feel that there is a lack of responsibility with the truth and facts.
Yeah.
A thing that has changed to me, that I've seen the change because I was the exact generation when it changed, was that when I was 12 in the schoolyard, everyone had a very strong opinion about what they were listening to. I'm into metal, I'm into rock, I'm into hip hop, blah, blah, blah. And then around 94, 95, it all changed. Suddenly, when Beck arrived, when the Beastie Boys arrived, everyone started to utter the words, I listen to a little bit of everything, which has become the norm. And it's perfectly fine. It's actually good. It's a positive, even if we know deep down that we know nothing and we don't listen to everything. I try to, but even I know I have my problems with that. So that being a change that we have to embrace, that there's so much now. There's so much that it's impossible to not have a blind spot.
Yeah.
True.
So the way to deal with that, a change, is, for example, for me, like the people who follow me, they know I really have zero interest for hard rock, metal, heavy metal. And I can rationalize it. I can say this is circus music and all that. At the same time, I know that there are lots of people who love that music, who feel with emotion about that. And the emotions are real. They might be misguided, but when I say that, I'm making fun of myself. Like it's like at one point, I think what has to change from the old rock critic culture, the heroes of writing, of the Grail Marcuses of the 60s, 70s, etc., is that now, because there are so many blind spots that are around us, we have to acknowledge them, and that whenever we say something critical, it has to be to say as much about us or more about us than it has to about the topic that we are actually criticizing, jokingly or not.
But how you deal with that, we each have a different way of dealing with it. For me, because I actually have too many interests, and I've acquired too many books that I won't live to read and too many albums I won't hear, that I keep getting back to this notion of specializing and focusing. And I've been told so many times, thank God, that it's okay to not be interested in everything. In other words, I don't guilt trip about not being fanatical about classical classical music. And I'll be the first to tell you that most world music eludes me because I don't have the sensibilities to get into South American music or African music unless it's been, say, diluted by Paul Simon or something like that. I don't understand it. And I have so much other stuff that I want to listen to. Why should I feel guilty if I'm not an expert on hip hop?
You shouldn't feel guilty.
Let some other reviewer review the hip hop albums. This is a permission I'm begging for that we're being denied because it's making you looking like you don't love, like the D word, diversity. Now, I'm probably going to be canceled for saying that. Okay, but I don't have the time in my life, for example, to become an expert on Ingmar Bergman films. I'd rather watch Steven Spielberg. That's just me. Should I hate myself because I don't like Bergman? Equally, should I hate myself because I don't listen to Frank Zappa every day? No, you said it, Stunty. There's too much out there, and you have to focus, and especially if you're going to do it as a professional.
But
if you're
like
you can't do everything.
In the so-called in the perceived golden age of rock criticism or music criticism, all of that was taken so seriously.
Too seriously.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and I think my take is that now you have to insert a little bit of humor, not necessarily, not irony, but like a sort of like a self, like you can say that the way, like I feel you can about how you deal with that. I personally think that something quite similar, but a little bit like that. Really, I have to make fun of myself a little bit on my blind spots, because otherwise, I don't want to either be the one that, okay, this is not my generation, this is not my scene. I acknowledge that, and then I build like a glass ceiling between it and me. I want to acknowledge that it might be good, and to make fun of myself for not yet having found my entry door in that, or something of the like.
Self-deprecation is very important in all of this. Can't take yourself too seriously, otherwise it gets really annoying.
Well,
but you still think you're serious when you're making jokes about yourself.
Well, Michael and I are serious in terms of how we handle our responsibility to our readers. Because whatever anyone tells you, Michael and I and any of the reviewers that I know, our obligation is to our readers, not to the advertisers.
That's right.
Okay, forget that. It's the separating church and state, or whatever they used to call it back in the day. Whereas in a lot of fields, the magazines are controlled by the advertisers, and it's basically you're just writing good news. Thank God, neither Michael nor I are told to suck up to advertisers.
Never was, and people still have that idea. Well, you're right for the magazine.
They don't believe it, Michael.
What's that?
Okay, no. Then I share some experience now from my part of work as in the advertising area. It's common that we book an advertisement in a special interest, not music, not records, not hi-fi, but in other areas we book an advertising, and then we say, okay, and we write the article for you, and here it is, and this is the article you print with the advertisement. It's common. It's common.
Well, advertorial is the way of the world now, but it's not. You can't turn the clock back. But like I say, Michael and I, we've known each other for literally decades. We've worked on the same magazines together. We've worked on opposing magazines together. We've had more meals together than I can count.
All paid for by manufacturers. Put that across, Ken. We were paid for. Our meals were paid for.
If you remember, Michael, we always split the bill. And if any man, this I think I want the listeners to know. Until high-end audio stopped at CES, every year before CES, there were about 15 or 20 of us would get together. Reviewers, manufacturers, all sorts of people. And the deal was this. Any topic was open, but any manufacturer who dared to mention their brand had to pick up the tab for all 20 people.
That's right.
And not once did it ever happen, and we always split the bill. So people like Michael and myself, we've paid our own way, we've paid for flights and this, that, and the other. If anyone still has this impression that we're these coddled journalists like the ones that get flown to the Paris catwalks, sorry, that's not the case. And that's one of the amusing things about hi-fi. But more pertinent, back to the music reviewing. I still maintain that there's just too much out there, Stunty, that there's so much material and so many people want to know what's what, that I think that's incumbent on the magazines to get experts in each field, or let's say, if you don't want to use the word experts, let's say specialists. One of my favorite magazines is a rock magazine called Shindig, and I trust their reviews. And same with Mojo. I trust their reviews because if suddenly there's a new album coming out like Steve Still's 1971 Berkeley, which is unreleased stuff, or someone's remastering a box set, when I read a review in that magazine, I know that that reviewer knows what he's talking about, number one. And number two, he knows how to write, because those magazines are high profile and they're not going to hand it to guys who cannot string together a sentence. And those are the important things for me. Are these magazines too esoteric for someone who's just bought their first record player or CD player, or just bought their first album? Perhaps. But in every single field anyone ever enters, you have to start from point zero. When I first got into watches, I didn't know a chronometer from a chronograph.
And you had a mentor. You had someone that to guide you, right? That's what's lacking today.
One thing I feel that's disappearing is that the post-millennials don't respect their mentors. And I don't care if
they don't have any mentors. They can just start a website and just do what they do, and no one's there to...
This is the problem, and that's when misinformation goes out. Can I just make one more remark about this? And this is relevant to music. I have a big problem with the biopics of late. But it actually started with the Buddy Holly story, and now we've got Rocket Man and Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, unfortunately, and this applies to the websites, when something gets up online, before that, when something got into print, or when something becomes a big Hollywood movie, ultimately it becomes the fact. So they do the Buddy Holly story while the band members were still alive, and for whatever Hollywood reason, they changed the names, and the guys were still alive. You're not going to do a film of the Beatles and call it Fred, Al, Mike, and Willie. It's John, Paul, George, and Ringo. I know that Rocket Man veered from the facts. I know that Bohemian Rhapsody veered from the facts. I haven't seen the new Elvis movie, but I'm sure that that plays with it. And I am aware of poetic license. I am aware of the need for the dramatic. But it's this playing fast and loose with facts that bothers me, strictly not as a music lover, not as a hi-fi enthusiast, but as an historian, which is what my field has been.
Movies are they've always been playing with the facts, always. Every biography you've ever seen on a film. By the way, the movie Babylon, I recommend the movie Babylon to everybody who cares about sound. It's a movie about when the silent movies switched over to sound movies. Yeah. It's hilarious. It's over the top, completely ridiculous, over the top, but you'd really like it if you care about sound. You'll enjoy that. Okay. Listen.
I would just like to remind, remind. Sorry, that's a bit presumptuous, but when I started to buy music magazines, why did I buy music magazines? Usually, a music magazine has an artist on the front page, on the cover. There's an interview. The first reflex why to buy a magazine is because of that kind of stuff. Quickly enough, if you're a music lover, you realize that that's not why you should buy a music magazine. Back in the 90s and before, of course, but before the internet, we bought magazines for the information, not the information of what whomever thought about this or that, but this record exists. We had, because you had to be there at the shop when the record was released, otherwise you missed it. So my point is that, I don't need to be respected by my reader. For me, the only thing that I should do is to be able to give good information to my audience. The minute I'm not doing that anymore, I'm done, and I'm fine with that. That means that I'm irrelevant, that I don't know where to look anymore. And really, I think that now it's all changed, because we don't need the magazines. Now I can find everything online. The shop, the brick and mortar shop, I know more about the stuff that is coming in the shop than they do. And not because I'm a music journalist, but because I'm a music lover and I buy records. So the only edge I can have on other people is the amount of information I process. I'm an information processor.
Yeah.
Then I have also, of course, my sensibility that I try to express in an interesting, entertaining.
That's what counts. How well you deliver the information that
Yeah.
you have, because people, two
Thank
people
you
with
so
the same
much. I
information,
was
and
waiting
one of
for
them
this
delivers it
sentence.
well,
Yeah.
and one doesn't. That's
Yeah, but
Exactly.
Stunty, do you ever
can
get
have
overwhelmed?
You can have the most valuable information if you present
Yes, yeah,
boring
Stunty, I was wondering if you ever just get
nobody
overwhelmed
will
by
I-
the sheer quantity.
I get like I have a few days in the week that I fear, because I know these are the days when there are more releases than other. I fear them because I know that, for example, I listen to jazz, to ethnographic music, to ambient, to hip hop, to just anything, absolutely anything. And Sundays, for example, in Europe, we have Juno, which is, I don't even go to publication. I go to record stores, to distributors. And the day when they have everything, sometimes I have, I almost wish I could tick off a genre, so I don't get to have to indulge, to impose myself that. And when I can't, that means that I put myself in hell, because I will have to catch up with that later, and it never stops. So it keeps adding. Sometimes you're like, I have to kill myself psychologically to go through all of that. But when I done it, I'm happy, because you will find, when people say this was a good year, every year is a good year for music. You just have to dig enough.
Yeah.
And that's the way. And that's how I managed to create something that is music journalism, that is of our time and not of the time when I was doing it 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I hope I managed to do it. And I don't know the form. I don't know the format. I don't know the medium that is the most suited for it, because I have to question myself all the time about that. Not that I necessarily do. I'm being very dramatic with that. But
well, I have to say that the most liberating thing for me in the last few years was accepting that I wasn't going to hear everything, on the collector side of me, that I wasn't going to own everything, and that my life wouldn't be depleted because I didn't hear everything. Again, which drove me back to this thing of, but it drove me back to this desire to focus on what was more important to me. Yes, I am certain I might have missed stuff. I've never been hang gliding. Who knows? I might have liked it. But the point is, there are so many other things that I find refreshing and fulfilling, and so much music that I know about that I want to hear without the new discoveries. I'm sorry to change the subject for a moment, but Michael, were there some other hot questions that we mustn't ignore? Because I'm sure that the comments list has been rolling. Did you find some more questions?
Nice you asked. I just wanted to make sure that you're all aware of that we reached the 2-hour mark by now.
Exactly.
So if you're fine with going on, okay.
We gotta. It's only fair to the people that made the effort to ask us questions.
I think
I would really like.
Yeah,
I would really like your
question. Exactly. Let's do 2 questions that come up. I agree with Liam. I don't think there has been too many questions, because I think they were all listening to you guys. Yeah, no, really. It was very few questions this time, because of the topic and the very cool way and manner you talk
What
about
you've
it.
missed, is when Michael and I have had too much wine, and when we take over restaurants. I don't know.
We're being very well behaved tonight.
I'm sorry, Santi, that I don't know if it works doing it over with Michael in the States, me in the UK.
You mean the time that I called you at home and did Jackie Mason, and you thought it was Jackie Mason calling you? Remember that?
That was seriously embarrassing. And the night we used to go, this is way off topic, but we used to go to with Michael Hobson of Classic Records, Michael 45, you will remember, Classic Records, which is now owned by Chad Kasem. Michael was like a divining rod when it came to fine wines. And every year at the Italian show, we would go to a restaurant in Milan, and he would find something vintage. And one night, 6 of us drank 6 bottles of strong red. And it's one of those things I wish we could have filmed, because it was shtick about hi-fi. And I think some of they would have, well, the late Herman, God bless him, rest in peace. He almost drove off the Autostrada about 4 times.
And he was the German importer of Herman Hoffman. He was a German importer of classic records and a bunch of other labels too, I think.
So it was audiophile and music lovers and vinyl all the way.
You want to ruin the whole discussion and bring up the ERC's Doors albums and ruin the whole thing, or no?
Oh, Michael,
you want to do that?
Like right before we started, before you came, Michael, me, Ken, and 45, we were talking about an aspect that I think is interesting mentioning, the oral history of music and the oral side of this. Now I just remember an example. This guy from called Mad Mike from Detroit, like one of the pioneers of techno, a black guy from a black community, from a band called Underground Resistance, very political and very, very charismatic. And I got to interview him. I spent a whole day in Paris showing him around. And before that, we did like a 3-hour discussion interview. And it wasn't going very well. I wasn't getting, like, I had like great questions, and I was feeling that we're holding back and all that. And at one point, okay, I have enough material for the article, and okay, so the interview is finished. Is the microphone off? Yes. Okay, so you did good. So now we can give you the right answers, the good ones. Publish them.
That's terrible.
Oh.
No,
Yes.
I don't operate that way. Ken, you don't operate that way either.
There are many artists, and I've seen that a few times in different types of music, in jazz, in avant-garde, like artists that will vet you through the process of the interview, and that will then give you information that you will still be able to use, but not for the article, but that will be the most useful for a wider and longer perspective on music, industry, etc. And we are in that position that where we get stuff like that, and we can get, and to open ourselves of being vessels for that. That is why we may stay relevant for a longer time than others. Who knows?
Okay, there's a certain topic now arising, and I think it's a good topic where we can briefly get into before we shut this stream down. And I just take one randomly because a lot of people talked about that, and let's take this one. Michael, what do you really think of the Doors ERC?
Okay, so there's a lot of misunderstanding about this reissue. And the first thing about it is that the tape that was used is the same tape, the very same tape that was used for the original mono release of that record in 1967. It's not deteriorated. It was inherently distorted. It has some terrible distortion on some of the tracks, and that's a given. And the label decided to reissue it. I've heard from many people who bought that record, and they're absolutely thrilled with it because that record was recorded on a 4-track recorder and never really mixed to real stereo. It's the stereo mix of it is not very good. The mono mix, despite all the problems, to the people who love Jim Morrison's voice, it gives them the sense of Jim Morrison being in the room, and it's absolutely fantastic. There is distortion on the record, but it's not a fake record. It's not a scam. It's not that, well, the tape is so deteriorated that why bother releasing it? It is what it is. And
Michael, I want to do something, if you allow me. I say things, I do comments, and you just say yes or no. I know you hate that probably, but I would love if you do that.
Listen, I went to law school. I'm good with.
Okay. Let's play this. Let's play this.
Yeah.
I think that the Jim Morrison voice on this ERC Doors is beautiful and amazing. Yes or no?
Yes.
The sound stage is so coherent and impressive that this is a real treat and experience.
Yes, on the end, you play the end on that record. If it doesn't give you the douche chills, I don't know what does. It's so much better than the stereo mix. Yes, I agree with that.
The separation of the instruments is stunning,
which mono can give you. Mono can be phenomenal. That's why that
was not yes or no.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay, that was my
I
question.
agree. It's not controversial. I don't know why this is a controversial record. I don't understand it, but whatever. What's controversial is that the guy only does 400 copies and sells them for a lot of money. That's controversial. That's his business model. I can't say anything about that. I don't like that necessarily, but that's what he does. But that's something else, you know.
Well, I have to go back and listen to the commercial release of the mono.
Josh D, excuse me. You asked several times for our comments on the ERC, and now you have them. Like them or dislike them. That's up to you. But I accept if you don't like them, because those things should always be up for discussion.
Michael, we've been talking for 2 hours. We did not mention ERC until 2 minutes ago, and somebody comments, "Is this an ERC commercial?" This is what is so annoying about.
Exactly.
No, it's not annoying. No, it's not annoying at all.
Michael, the reason why Michael F said it's annoying is because, and this applies in every field, cars, wine, whatever, clothing, the minute you name check something, you have alienated all the other brands for starters. So, for example, if everyone's always asked, everyone loves lists. So if someone were to say to Michael, "We're going to do an article. I want you to list your 10 favorite loudspeakers." Michael, how many loudspeakers have you heard in your life? 2,000? 3,000?
Probably.
So 1,900 people that are ticked off.
Can you name them all?
I didn't keep notes, but you see, the thing is, you cannot discuss reviewing, you cannot discuss pressings without mentioning specifics, because otherwise there's no frame of reference.
That's right.
It's one thing to illustrate something and keeping someone anonymous, like not saying which particular label gave you a hard time. But when you're talking about, if Michael were asked, which is the best Doors first album in stereo, and you've probably got 4 copies or 5 copies. I know that the Crosby, Stills and Nash, I have about 7 or 8 vinyl copies, all different. Is that suddenly a plug for Atlantic Records? No.
No.
We were asked a specific question, in this case, the ERC, which I haven't heard.
Yeah.
And for someone to be slightly aggravated or slightly annoyed to think that we're suddenly shills, sorry.
Let me give you a slight different perspective. That comment from George G might have just been ironic as well.
Yeah, it could be. That irony does not travel well on the internet. That's a big problem.
Let's give him the benefit of the doubt.
Yes.
Josh, anyway, we know you had tongue in cheek.
Good point, Stundy. Good point.
Yeah, tongue in cheek.
Because it was a sort of elephant in the room, so it would be good time. He got you if he did. He really got you.
Yeah.
I don't mind being gotten either that way. It's fine to be gotten that way. It's all right.
Okay.
Are we done?
Another question for us to sign off with, Michael? Anything
I have
else?
to go cook dinner. I cook all the food in my house, so I have to cook dinner.
Thank you so much. Over 2 hours. Only Bernie Gruntman did that so far.
Well, Stunty, I've never met you before, but I really enjoyed talking with you. I think you're a really interesting, smart guy, and I hope I get to talk to you again sometime.
Let's do that then. Yeah,
we will do that anytime.
Yeah, for me, just like to sum it up, like I'm sure you got that bled through, but the topic of music, of journalism, for me is very dear. In France, to be a journalist, you have to get a card that says that you're a journalist, and it's only the journalist like union who delivers it to you or not. And with that comes tax exemptions and advantages. So basically, that is kind of like a grail to get. But like, you can't call yourself a journalist, or you could, but like, especially in the new world, to what Ken was saying, that like what is truth and like opinion and all that, everyone can say they're a journalist.
Yeah.
Well, I can say I'm a journalist even when I don't have that card, because I try to have that discipline. But it's not even a discipline, because it's not difficult. It's like when you're driven by passion, like I know Michael is. I'm learning about you, Ken, and obviously passion is like, because you can say stuff that maybe you shouldn't sometimes.
Well, you see, there's something I have to say about that. First of all, about the definition of a journalist. I have an editor who says I'm not a journalist because I'm not covering wars in Ukraine and I'm not covering hunger in India. I get that. I'm not out for a Pulitzer Prize. Maybe she says I'm just a writer. But Stunty, thank you for pointing out that one thing Michael and I share, even when we're arguing, and this is the most important thing about all of this. I'm sure that some of the some of the viewers might be angry with us or disappointed or offended. But the bottom line for me and Michael is passion. We have devoted more than a half a century to a love of music and tried to translate it into, maybe you might disagree with our opinions, our way we express it, but what we've tried to do is share the love for it, share the passion for it, hopefully share the knowledge. And my attitude is very simple. If I help just one person get a killer sound system, if I help just one person discover an artist they might not have discovered, it's all worthwhile.
And when you hear from those people, and you do hear from them, it's just years later, it's really great. I mean, I get these emails now when I started the new website, people saying, 20 years ago, you took a phone call from me and you spent 20 minutes with me and you did this for me. And I don't, there's a guy, Darren Meyer. Darren Meyer is an extremely talented engineer who left PS Audio and he's now working for Parasound. He called me up or emailed me when he was a kid and he said he wanted advice about getting into this industry. And I said, get an engineering degree. And then you can be in any industry if you don't like this one, once you find out what's going on the inside of this industry. And he's become very successful and he gives me this credit and I don't ask for this credit. It's just the greatest. It's just the greatest thing. That is the greatest thing. So
that's a very positive note at the end of the stream, gentlemen.
Well, I can tell you a story about when all the rock and roll writers in the early 70s got together at Arden Studios in Memphis to start a union for music critics. But that's a story for the next time because I won't tell it now.
Yeah, we didn't want to leave this with anyone thinking that we're complete miseries, or me anyway. Thank you for the opportunity. We absolutely love music. We love hi-fi.
This was great.
We realize it's one of those pleasures that it's beyond value and it's universal, and whatever your taste, whatever your bias, whatever format you listen to, however many records you have or haven't got, it's all about the music and it's all about the heart.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to say, because that's very important, because maybe I picked a bit too much about it. You delivered something that is invaluable to all of us. You shared your knowledge and your experience over decades. And that's the beauty this is the beauty of this medium. This stream probably will stay here for 20, 30, 40 years when we are all gone. But people will see what great guys and how big your heart is when it comes to this topic. And that's very nice of you that you shared this with us tonight.
Thanks for the opportunity.
What are you trying to sell us? What are you selling us?
I'm just speaking out of my heart now.
But that's what you do also. I mean, you do this. This is not your gig, and you're doing this and bringing people.
All four of us are doing this. All four of us are doing this for love.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
Because I know I got to be up at 4:30 tomorrow morning to go to the world's best vintage hi-fi jumble sale in Tunbridge, and there's going to be 1,500 or 2,000 crazy audiophiles looking for bargains.
Wow.
Okay. Good luck with
that.
Gentlemen, thank you so much, and let's do this again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.